Hello, everyone, and welcome to a conversation about race, equity, and justice, learning history to create a better future. My name is Jornay Armand, Head of Educator Innovation at Flipgrid. And at Flipgrid, we are committed to ensuring that all voices are heard and all voices are respected. And so we have been having these incredible conversations throughout this year, really delving into maybe some knowledge that maybe we are not aware of, so that we can open our minds and open our hearts to making changes so that our students can have a better world and a better life. And so with that being said, I want to introduce to you our panelists for today. They will introduce themselves, tell you about their roles and their passion for this work.
Hey everyone, I'm Jadiksavi Jalaba. I am a high school history teacher here in Brooklyn, New York. I service overage undercredited students, so my students' ages range from 16 to 21. I'm also the founding president of YB Educational Resources, which is a nonprofit that's geared to giving out resources to educators all over the world, and your host of the Flipgrid series, Acturita Culturally Responsive Teaching. My passion for this work are my students. It's just elevating their voices however I can. So thanks for having me today, Jornay.
Wow, it's good to be back here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ken Shelton. I'm an educator based in Los Angeles. I've spent most of my educator career teaching in the Los Angeles Unified School District. I'm no longer in the classroom. Now I do all of the following. I give talks, consult, advise. I work with everything from organizations to schools, to school districts, to departments of education, and then outside the U.S. ministries of education, primarily in the areas of equity, technology, culturally competent pedagogy, and anti-bias, anti-racist work.
Erica, we're not hearing your sound right now, so maybe let's check the mic on Erica. And James, do you mind introducing yourself for the moment? And we'll make sure that we're good to go with Erica.
No problem. Hello, everyone. My name is James Ponzo. I'm a first-year professor at the University of Buffalo. I've been teaching for the last 4.5 years while working on my dissertation. All of my classes deal with African-American studies and some studies of ancient Africa. My passion is definitely my students and also my people. I look up to everyone on this panel and I want to be just like them when I grow up. So I'll talk more about my dissertation and some of the work that I'm doing as we continue with our discussion.
Incredible. And as Erica tries to get her sound back, we are just so thankful to have Erica Buddington. She is the creator and founder of Langston League. She has a passion for designing curriculum and experiences for students. So if you haven't checked out Langston League's resources in the Flipgrid Discovery Library, they are ready and ready to launch just for you and your students. So to kick this off, I'm just going to share my personal experience with all of you. As an educator, I'm almost 40 years old, and I reflect back on my education in school. And I have to tell you that from conversations that I've been having with people such as my mentor, Ken, other educators around the world, other thought leaders, reading books, etc., there's been such an enlightenment on so much that I did not know because it was not a part of my learning journey in school. There was a lot of information that had either been distorted or incomplete when it comes to history. So my first thoughts about that with the panelists, like, what is your experience when it comes to maybe an incomplete history, and what are the effects of that on our students and in education in general?
Who wants to start? Can I jump in or?
Yeah, I'm gonna let y'all go first because okay. I got this big smile because I love the question, Jornay.
Same here. So first thing I wanted to say is the first chapter. So my dissertation centers on the works of James Baldwin. And in the first chapter, I talk about, I knew we'd be able to have more conversations. The first chapter, I talk about education. And this one's for Ken too. I pair, in my first chapter, Ta-Nehisi Coates is having a conversation with James Baldwin. And we're talking about what needs to be done specifically to educate Black children. Let me jump to my experiences. When I went away to Indiana University as a freshman in college, I took African American literature because that was the last literature course that was available. When I took that class, I fell in love with African American studies. At once, I felt happy that I was learning all this stuff that I hadn't even scratched the surface of in high school and elementary school. It was only every Black History Month. It was just the "I Have a Dream" speech. And I love MLK, but there's so much. Fast forward to now, and all my students, pretty much all of my students, have had the same experience. When they take my class, we start off with Dr. John Henry Clark, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. We always start on the continent of Africa, so my students know that our history did not start in slavery, and they feel the same way. They're happy that they're taking everything. One quick thing, after what one of my fellow faculty members calls the George Floyd uprisings and protests, I got a lot of emails from former students and other people in my department just happy about what they learned and how they can put what's taking place in context. So again, I want to give someone else a chance to talk, but I love these questions.
So of course I'm going to speak because I know Ken is waiting for to drop the bombshell. So I'll just go, Ken. But from my experience, I've been teaching for 11 years. And my first, experience with the curriculum was me getting a binder. And it was pre-made learning objectives and aims and textbooks. And fresh out of college, I was just I'm not doing this. First of all, I'm not reading that textbook because it's 3,000 pages. I'm not doing this today. But also, I wasn't too fond of the idea of teaching something someone else created. Fast forward a few months ago, my school was supposed to visit Ghana. And the idea was that as a school, we introduced students to the 1619 Project. We actually partnered with schools in Ghana, and the Minister of Education was going to take us on a tour of different schools. Prior to that visit, we actually got to pair our students on a Zoom. And the question that was asked from students in Ghana was, why do you believe Africans were enslaved? Why did they choose us? And my students gave all types of answers. And you know how students are. Sometimes it's just well, if you think about the textbook, and I had to remind my students about their textbooks and it being made by colonizers, but also our textbooks are made by colonizers as well. And so I had to take a step back and think about how many teachers are still teaching to text that was made from somebody that does not look like us, right? So my students have had the experience of being introduced to text and curricula that I created because I decided that 11 years ago. And I got the opportunity 7 years ago to create my own books. But how many other teachers are in institutions, because that's what they are when someone controls it, right? Are in institutions where they can't basically exercise their freedoms of teaching what they want to teach and how they want to teach our students. So Ken, I'm going to let you have that.
No, I'm okay. So can I just say I'm so thrilled to be here. So before I respond to the question, I do want to share what the professor shared. First of all, James Baldwin is a personal hero of mine. And I will share with everyone, Journée, when you talked about, curriculum and gaps in the curriculum, I can share with you all a quick story around the fact that in my AP American Lit class, when I was in high school, we were essentially indoctrinated in reading only the classics. So for everyone watching, just ask yourself, do a quick inventory of who the authors are. What is their gender identity? What is their race? What is their socioeconomic status of all of the authors of the classics? Now, the reason why I'm sharing that is because just like with the professor and myself, most of my exposure to anything related to Black history was either, let me put it this way, if it was from school, it was only in February. And then the rest was my own family. And I have and Journée, you and I have talked, and it's even in one of my talks, I have a long, rich history of my family, whether it's my paternal grandfather being a Tuskegee Airman to finding out later that I had many cousins that were that were in the Black Panther Party as well. Now, with that being said, going back to the reference James Baldwin, I remember literally begging my AP American Lit teacher why we couldn't read Langston Hughes or James Baldwin in high school. And I remember being told it's not part of the curriculum. And so for everyone watching, I would not only encourage you to consider reading James Baldwin, and I'm curious what the professor will say to this, I would encourage you to read A Talk to Teachers, and then keep in mind when he wrote it, and ask yourself how much of that applies to present day right now. Now, with that being said, the whole idea around gaps in the curriculum, I think there's two parts to it. One, the curriculum is filled with lies. And so let me define lies. Lies are either an intentional omission of something or an intent to deceive. And when you intentionally omit something out of the curriculum, you're telling lies. And I'm calling it what it is. And that's where you get into the whole idea around a colonized curriculum is how can I create a situation where in the context of you developing your cognitive abilities and you understanding your awareness in your social context, how can I do it in a way that just by way of going through that endeavor, you look upon yourself as being less than? If I don't celebrate your heroes, if I don't celebrate the things that are part of your ancestral history that are significant accomplishments, then you're never going to look at yourself as being capable of doing those things. And that's unfortunately what happens. Honestly, we're talking history, but that happens across the curriculum. And that's where you want to get into the whole idea around two things. One is the decolonization of the curriculum. And then two, to ask yourself, how inclusive is the curriculum in regards to the types of narratives that are told? And then a big one, who's telling them? And then how are they represented? And Erica's back. So I'll leave it over to Erica now.
Yeah. Are we still on the eraser question? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Just to, touch on what Ken said, we are nuanced people. We are not a monolith. And I feel like to engage our students, particularly at the local level, I see a lot of people trying to build out supplemental history initiatives, and that's great, right? But we can't paint Black history, brown history, Indigenous history with a broad stroke. Like, we have to realize that there are sectors that have to be spoken to from a local standpoint to engage kids where they are. So let me give you an example of that. For instance, I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant, short Bed-Stuy, right? Brooklyn, New York. I see you, right? And often I used to teach at a school here, and I was teaching everything from the American Revolution to Jim Crow to slavery, et cetera, like all of your typical things, right? And there was this phrase that used to drive me crazy. It's like the Jim Crow South. And what that does is it negates Jim Crow, it negates slavery, it negates all of these different aspects as a national system. Like, it's not just the South, right? And so at no point did students know that there was a Bridge African Methodist Episcopal Church where Harriet Tubman once spoke a few blocks away, right? At no point did children know that there was a lodge started by two women who were formerly enslaved in 1888 on McDonough Avenue, where, McDonough Street rather, where, there were debutante balls and, conversations with Weeksville residents and Carsville residents and freed people talking about how to progress, right? And so we're talking about these movements. We're talking about the Jim Crow South. We're talking, right? And the reality is, like, it's way more nuanced than that. And honestly, a lot of that was happening in our backyard. And so how do we engage students about our triumphs and our tribulations, right, with the things that are happening right where they live? And so I really believe that the decolonizing of our instruction starts with home. It starts with unearthing what's happening right here, and then showing students, like, yes, this was happening in the South, right? But look what was happening in New York at the same time. And the question you should be asking yourself as you're, sitting these textbooks in front of students that, commits negation and erasure of our history, is you should be asking them to ask themselves, where were Black people during this time, right? Where were brown folks? Where were Native Americans? Where were Indigenous people? Because these are the questions that these secondary sources are not answering. So, yeah.
Can I say something? So going along with what Erica was saying, that's one of the things that I wrote down. First of all, Ken, absolutely, A Talk to Teachers, written in 1963, James Baldwin. That's the first thing that I bring up in my first chapter of my dissertation on education. So, but like Erica was saying, one of the things I wrote down, one of my mentors in Buffalo is Dr. Lillian Williams. She is the resident expert on Mary Talbert, on the Black club women, club movement. We have the Michigan Street Baptist Church, which is where the members of who would go on to create the Niagara movement used to meet. Mary Talbert lived 2 blocks from there. And that's one of the things I was going to respond to in Jornea's first question that she wrote, is the fact that not only are there certain textbooks, I think it's awesome that Yuritsa was able to create her own textbook. One that I thought is good that I actually photocopy for my students and we read portions of is the African American Odyssey. I feel like that's a pretty good textbook. I still go in and kind of do a supplemental lecture on, the things that they read. But Erica is absolutely right. One of the things we can do is, one of my mentors told me in the past, it's very important to help students. I do want you to have a better idea. I tell my students this every semester. At the end of this class, I want you to have a better idea of African American studies, but I want you to be able to make connections and think critically. I want you to take that away from my classes after you have them for the semester. And another thing that's important is connecting what they're learning to their experiences. Coates also talks about this in Between the World and Me. So thankfully, for example, next semester, I'm teaching a course on Buffalo. It's on African American cities and it centers on Buffalo. I have Dr. Lillian Williams as a mentor and a friend who I can go to. And she actually taught the class before I did. But kids need to know what's going on in their own backyard. Thankfully, I see the two of you are from Brooklyn. We have a lot of students at the University of Buffalo from New York City. I'm jealous of you guys anyway. I have a tattoo of Malcolm X on my right forearm, and I haven't even visited like Harlem and different places. And just one last thing. It's something, because when Jornea and I talked before, like when we were talking about being on the panel and stuff like that, I talked for about 20 minutes about A Talk to Teachers by James Baldwin. So it's nice to see that we're all on the same wavelength here. So,
my goodness, I am just amazed at this moment in time, because as we're talking about this erasure in history, I'm really thinking about a moment where I sat in front watching Ken Shelton share a firsthand account from a family member. Now, for me, I always state firsthand, experiences truly impact people. And to hear Ken share the information that he learned from family members had a great effect on me and everyone else who was a part of that conversation. So first and foremost, I truly believe that the issues that we are facing right now are due to this level of ignorance or not being able to have, the knowledge readily available. And the only way to solve that is to start talking about those things, right? Because as we talk, we learn more, we start researching. I mean, as soon as Ken starts talking, I'm Googling, I'm learning more, right? And so, what's really interesting as I was reflecting on this, and I'm thinking about my two kids who are 10 and 7, the more, generations keep passing and they won't have those firsthand accounts of certain things that happened in history, it becomes even more difficult for them to connect. So what advice and ideas do you have for educators to ensure that students can have those firsthand experiences? I know, we have some incredible partners inside of Discovery, and the World War II Museum actually has this topic with an actual red tail. So if you know anything about the Tuskegee Airmen, they have a Tuskegee Airman sharing about his experience with a double victory. He's fighting for this country, but the country is against him, right? And so what can we do as educators to ensure that our students have these rich experiences so that they can understand things that happened in the past to connect with what's going on right now and why, things in the past are impacting what they're going through at this moment in time, and what can they do and what can educators do to empower their students to take action to make changes for a better future?
I think educators have to become more educated. Like, it sounds like common sense, right? But honestly, and like Erica said, ask students, where were African Americans or where were Black people during all of these events? I feel like educators, once we teach something, it's almost like, okay, this is what I said, so this is exactly how it goes. And for me, like my family, we're not from America, but in teaching African American history and teaching US history, I still needed to know my own history. I still needed to know about Panama. And the only person that could really tell me about Panama beyond reading American textbooks, because we know how that story goes. I had to ask my mom, Ma, what's going on with the invasion? And I learned a lot about even how I survived as a baby during the invasion. And so we have to become educated. We have to ask questions that we know is going to hurt. Like, I didn't know that I survived for 6 months off of, drinking sugar and water. And these are stories that are not being told in textbooks about, how even though the Americans wanted to take down a specific ruler in Panama, they actually destroyed the economy in Panama, which is still destroyed today. So sometimes when we think about history and we think about American history, we also have to think about how it impacts the world. All of our students are not American. I know most of my students are not American. The families are not American. So even though I'm telling them, yes, Brooklyn was a plantation, and yes, this is our history, this is not all of their history. Their history is beyond just what America has to offer. And so we have to be very cognizant of, what is it that we're teaching and why are we teaching it? So I'm not just teaching the civil rights movement. My mentor the other day, he was like, Yaritza, it's not an achievement gap, it's an access gap. And he had to really tell me, give me that knowledge, tell me why. And he told to me about the civil rights movement. He actually discussed how education for African Americans was at its highest point during the civil rights movement. And I had to engage in that conversation more. I didn't feel dumb or anything. It was just more like, all right, tell me more. As educators, we have to be vulnerable in asking questions. And I feel like that's the first step.
Want to snap to that.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of my favorite quotes that I think is relevant to what you're talking about here, because I think all of us, if we all embody the role that we're all educators, whether we're formally in a classroom environment or, to borrow from one of my favorites, Dr. Chris Emden, you're at church, you're in the barbershop, all the above, or in the case with many of my former students, it was out on the basketball court. You have to think about what you're talking about. You have to think in terms of two parts. One is, what degree of personal empowerment does it serve for, like what Yaritza just shared, my personal history? What is, why am I who I am and where I am and have access to what I have access to? And what were all of the historical events that led up to that? In addition to that, I want to share with you all, because I have it pulled up here, one of my favorite quotes from Assata Shakur. No one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that knowledge will help set you free. And that's precisely why you want to think about the narratives that we get exposed to around the origins of all of us. Yaritza, you talked about, obviously you're from Panama. I mean, there's we could rewind the clock all the way back to Manifest Destiny and then connect that to why, what's going on in regards to, the colonization of Central America, which was for the extraction of the resources that were available at the expense of the people. I've even shared with folks, the whole idea around, the history of Haiti. And I'm like, you should know that there's Haiti at one point. Like, here's an example. And I talked with this with Journée, our good friend, Dr. Sarah Thomas. I talked to her about it, like, even understanding that Haiti at one point was the largest exporter of sugar in the entire world. And so, for us to be able to do what you're saying around understanding our own personal history and being able to tap into first person accounts, that's to me where two things. One is where technology comes in, that how might I be able to connect with a primary source to essentially liberate my learning, and then that I can share with others. I remember on a recent trip, a couple of years ago, it was my 4th of 7 trips down to South Africa. And I would consider myself pretty well versed in South African history, partially because I think I had shared this with you. I studied Zulu in college, but I took a trip out to Robben Island. Now, one of the docents there on Robben Island his name is Vasumi. He was a former prisoner on the island from 1978 to 1990. And so, of course, I'm like, okay, if you don't mind, I have a lot of questions to ask. I'm going to share with you what I know. And then I want to know things that I don't know and fill in the gaps. First person, primary source. And we ended up talking with him for like 2 straight hours. Let me tell you, that 2 hours right there was more valuable than any time I spent in any formalized classroom studying South African history. I know what happened when he was arrested with 3 of his friends in Port Elizabeth for literally just hanging out. And so the whole point I'm sharing that with you and the audience here is 2 parts. One, they were arrested for just hanging out on the street. They were arrested and they were charged with, and you're going to love this, crimes against the government, intimidation, and then there was one other identifier they used that was the equivalent of loitering. Now, I take that and I spoke to a group of Black students at a school in Kentucky, and I said, okay, do you all know that there is a law going through your state legislature right now that the police can stop and question groups of 3 or more? And of course, the kids didn't know that. And I'm like, let me tell you a history lesson on where that could end up. And so then I told them that whole story of South Africa. And then they were like, well, wait a minute, we're just walking. Yes. So that's why it's important to connect the past with the present, because the past is many cases is an indicator of what either is happening in the present or what is going to happen in the immediate future. And if you understand how things were used in the past for, indoctrination, subjugation, incarceration, all those sorts of things, when you understand how those work, it gives you a completely different lens on how things are operating right now. So I think the ability to connect to as many primary or at minimum secondary sources as possible will not only provide us with a means to learn things that aren't a part of the standardized curriculum, but will also give us an opportunity to understand what is my presence in this place, what is my role in this place. And that's why I do want to emphasize one quick thing for my last comment here, is that's why I think it is important for us to also recognize that we need to learn the history of the indigenous peoples on the lands that we inhabit right now. Okay, we need to learn that too. Otherwise, that just equates to another form of erasure as well.
So
Very good points. And, Erica is a curriculum designer. I'm blown away every day by what she creates so that students can have rich experiences. And I am in love with the pop culture PD, because students can learn so much from what they see on various TV shows, etc. And educators can leverage that to spark some or ignite some type of love of history for their students. Maybe they start there, but then they go and research. So Erica, talk to us a little bit about how educators can possibly use pop culture PD. I know you use a lot of, I've seen Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Sister. My 2 girls have been watching Sister, which blows my mind because I watched that as a kid myself, and they're all into it. And they do bring up really important parts of history that are perfect entry points for a conversation to go even further. So share with us the way that you utilize pop culture to really educate students.
So the experience for me has been very layered. I feel that, for parents, we're tapping into the nostalgia, right? And so we want parents to remember those shows you watched growing up and then pause for a moment with the new lenses you've been given as you've grown, right? And rewatch them. And we want you to engage with those themes and have conversations with yourself, because we create mirrors. So they're not just for kids. For any learner, I want you to look at some of the things you might have enjoyed when you were 16, 17. And then now let's have a conversation about how the Parkers really, paved the way for some of the positive conversations we're having about plus size Black women, but also has a lot of jokes that are fat phobic or transphobic, right? We can look at different things like Lovecraft Country. And, I was just talking about the navigating of this national system. And so the fact that episode 1 has us in this very scary space that we're currently experiencing in modern day all the time with police officers in Massachusetts immediately negates this whole Jim Crow South concept, right? And so we have people delving into Detroit's landscape through Tia and Tamara, and having conversations about how, growing up in a certain environment, what are lessons you learned if you lived on this side of town or that side of town if you grew up in Detroit, and how do they differ? And so we're really getting folks to go back and look at these things and pull from them really important conversations that you can have in your classrooms and really you can have with each other, right? Because I'll be honest, 50% of our, DMs are from folks that are my age and older that are saying, listen, I know this for my kids, but y'all just put me on to something and I didn't even realize, like, I'm blown away. So my kids gonna get this, but right now I'm watching. And so I just wanted to also add that, a lot of what we do is sparked by primary sources, as Ken mentioned. Like, that's really where we need to get. I can't emphasize this enough. And it breaks my heart that I even have to say this, because the material should be out there, right? But I get so many emails from people asking me, where do I find resources to negate what my students are learning in their social studies courses, right? I get so many people saying, like, where can I find an entire curriculum? And the reality is, like, there are a lot of items out there, but nothing that provides like the nuance that we need, nothing that shows you all, like, that's all encompassing. And that's going to be really hard to do. And so what I say to folks is, the reality is you're going to have to go and look for it. So I would like to provide some resources, right? So folks should be searching their topics in the Digital Public Library of America. You should be searching in archive.org. You should be searching the Library of Congress. Like, I'm going to probably pronounce this wrong. Hathitrust.org, HATHITRUST.org is an archive with 17.5 million digitized items, and it's nonprofit, and everything is free and open access. And so anything that I'm researching or anything I came across in a textbook or something that was given to me from the powers that be, I would say, okay, this is cool. I need to go and do my own research. And 9 times out of 10, I would find primary sources that would completely negate what the students were going to be learning that day, right? Things that were telling the actual truth. And so it's important for educators to do their own research. And I know that can be tiresome, and right? But when you get accustomed to this archive search, when you get your Boolean operators together and you know exactly what you're searching, right? It becomes second nature. So now when I design, like, the first thing I do is I pull those primary sources. And by the time I get to the secondary text, I'm like, that's wrong, this wrong too, right? Because I have letters written by the folks in question. I have, records, census records of how old they were and how much land they owned and, the homes they lived in. I have images from the Schomburg and from NYPL that show me what the inside of their homes look like. So you can tell me about this poor Black family that grew up here, and right. And next thing I know, I'm looking at this beautiful home and landscape, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is not true. This is not accurate. Primary sources, that's what they do. So a lot of our pop culture PD is fueled by us finding a really dope primary source. And then someone in the crew will say, yo, that's in episode 5 of Fresh Prince season 2. Let's highlight them together. Because we know that kids are going to be learning about this movement in 8th grade. They love Fresh Prince. If you go into Forever 21 or an H&M right now, actually, I don't support H&M, but if you go to any of these stores right now, you'll see the 90s swag is heavy. Like, kids, are interested in what was just my childhood for me, but to them, it's like, we're trying to relive that. I'm like, cool, let's relive it, but also use it as an engagement point. Also use it as a gateway, right, to learn other things. So that's really what Pop Culture PD is about.
I love that. And it goes right along with Yuritz's advocacy for culturally responsive teaching as well. And I just can see, students just being empowered and inspired by educators to do that research themselves. Provide them with those resources, provide them with the skills and the knowledge of how to do the searching, and let them come to you and share with the class, what did they find? Information that maybe was left out of that social studies weekly that they had to read this week, that has all these missing pieces. Let them fill in the gaps and have that critical conversation with one another. So let's continue this conversation. I love where this is going, and I can see so many educators getting ideas from the resources that you just provided.
Jornay, can I actually add one thing? Erica just reminded me of it. So this is, let's talk about research. Even using the French Prince of Bel-Air, the theme song. We know where he was from, right? Born where? West Philly.
West Philadelphia.
Okay, so here's one. connecting pop culture for those watching. Look up, why was he born in West Philly? Why did he only grow up in West Philly? And here's the key. What happens when you go a little bit farther west and you get to Levittown? And then now do some research on redlining, and not just redlining, but why, which Jornay knows this because this is part of my family history. Why weren't all servicemen allowed to use their GI Bill to buy homes? And further to that point, look at the median home value in West Philly and compare it to Levittown going back 50 years to present day. And then ask yourself about generational wealth. And you even mentioned, Detroit. I always share with people, if you look at the urban development, if you will, of Detroit, ask yourself the following question. Why is it that so many of those suburbs are wealthy and they have their own school districts? Studying history, go and look up Milliken versus Bradley, which is a Supreme Court decision from 1974. So that's where, again, connecting even the pop culture. I used to have my students do a project on redlining and stories of the community. And you know what, because he was one of my favorite rappers, of course, I would do the connection because I would have the students listen to and analyze the lyrics of Project Windows by Nas. And that was the segue into. So I'm getting goosebumps listening to Erica share all this because I'm like, that's how you do it.
Yeah, I actually grew up in Hempstead, which is right next to Levittown, Long Island, right? And so growing up, the commentary was always, this used to be a white neighborhood and then Black folks moved in and white flight took place, but that wasn't true, right? I remember driving with my parents and saying, like, if that's the case, why is there an African Methodist Episcopal church here that was established in the 1800s? That don't make sense. That means there was a Black presence here all along, right? And then come to find out later on in high school, I had friends who had, because the deed of your home never changes. And even though the law changes and certain things can't be enforced, right, the deed of the home never changes. And there were deeds with commentary that specifically said Black people cannot purchase this home. Like, this home cannot, in Levittown, the nation's first suburb, they made it very clear who was allowed to purchase there for quite some time. And that today is the reason why generational wealth hasn't trickled down. So many homes in that space still belong to so many of those families. And that's Manytown, USA. That's not just Levittown, right? So, yeah.
Can I add something to that? So just thinking about that too, if I brought that up in my class, I would also say, so my class knows that sometimes I play clips from The Daily Show. This is in college, from my college classes. But the old Daily Show host, Jon Stewart, he actually brought Bill O'Reilly on because O'Reilly used to talk all the time about how he was a self-made man. And then when he brought up Levittown and where his family used to live in Levittown, he finally had to admit, okay, maybe I did get some help somewhere. I had another one, but I completely forgot it, but just go ahead. Oh, A Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, where he talks about, it's about Chicago, but he talks about redlining and the, I'm trying to remember the name of the mortgages that they were giving us around that time. But yeah, so.
They were part of the Federal Housing Authority loans, FHA loans. Yeah. But the key with those loans was if you were, going back to the servicemen, what would happen is you would get the loan to buy the house. And then in many cases, either it was a gift or it was a no interest loan. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the collateral is the home that you got. But they literally had a line they would draw where if you were a Black serviceman, you were not going to be given that loan to buy a home in that area. And then if you think in terms of that, it's not even just that. Like, adding to it, there's a reason why my grandfather and his brother couldn't attend the Ohio State University. A lot of PWIs would not accept the GI Bill to pay your tuition. And so that's when you started to see a big growth in the attendance at HBCUs, among other things. So, but you brought up one other quick thing I would just add, and that is, now I'm just drawing a blank. Anyway, go ahead.
I'm just saying, as you guys are talking, this is, concrete examples of systemic racism. And this is affecting our entire nation, our schools, our students in so many different ways. And sometimes as educators or maybe as students, we might not necessarily see it as such until we're enlightened at some point, right? And so what are maybe some examples that you can give of this? And we've already heard a couple of examples such as redlining, et cetera, but some that happen within schools that educators can be more aware of to take action to create that better future for their students.
I think there's a couple things. First of all, just going back to A Talk to Teachers by James Baldwin. I like that that's a focal point of this conversation. But he talks about in there how what happens to Black students when they find out that they're not included in the text, they're not included in the curriculum. He talks about what it does to them mentally. Another thing is, this is something that I point out to my students too, Baldwin talks about the paradox of education. He talks about how on the one hand, if you're an educator, he believes that your job is to create, you should, what's the word I'm looking for? Enhance the learning of your student, get them to think critically, get them to ask questions like, why are we here? Why are the rules the way they are? But he said the paradox is the nation, the country, society does not want these type of thinkers. They don't want these types of thinkers. And if you look at the history of what has happened to Black leaders throughout our history here in this country, that just proves that. Another thing that I was thinking about, because thankfully you gave us the questions beforehand, is retention and recruitment. Not only on the K through 12 level, I think I only had one Black teacher in my entire K through 12 experience, one Black teacher. But it's happening so much on the college level too. Like right now, I've read about it, but now it's upfront and personal at different universities. So that's a major problem. And then I'm going back to what Yuritsa was saying when she mentioned textbooks. We know, for example, what was going on in Texas. I think it was a couple years ago when remember they changed the wording about like slavery and stuff like that. They said that instead of saying that Africans were kidnapped and brought to this country, they were saying that they came here for job opportunities. And then when there was any kind of conflict, they completely removed that from the curriculum. So one thing that educators can do is make sure that they don't have these types of textbooks that they're teaching out of. And yeah, I'm going to stop talking. Someone else can go.
So what comes to mind, I mean, with my experience, like I mentioned, my students' ages range from 16 to 21. And so I automatically think about that push out rate, that school to prison pipeline, which exists. My students, like I've mentioned this on social before, I mean it. Either I lose a student each year to gun violence or they're in prison. And it's not because they're bored. It's not because they're born criminals. It's because the system is failing them. To me, there's no relevancy in what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. You have spots and, you have some teachers who are doing it. You have some teachers who don't know where to start. And then you have schools that can't support them because leaders don't even know how to do it. And so for me, I think about those teacher programs, those graduate school programs that are not really giving teachers the help and the assistance that they need before they push them out, right? And give them this 5-year loan forgiveness program. So now they're in our inner city schools and they don't know how to teach our students of color. I have to constantly think about my students because when they first sit in my classroom, I'm just like, okay, you don't know how to read, you don't know how to write, but you know how to rap, you know how to put things together, you know how to critically think, when something took place last night, you knew who was by the train station and how they ended up at McDonald's. So you have a memory, right? But somewhere along the lines, someone has failed them. And a lot of people don't want to say that it was them. And it has to be somebody, right? I don't blame the kids at all because they've been in school from the time they was 5 years old. I believe now, I think you can start at 3, right? And so when we think about all of the instructors and all of the teachers and all of the classrooms that they set in, and folks just push them out because of their behavior or push them out because they asked a few questions that teachers were not able to handle. Now they're 16 to 21 in a classroom with 5 credits, and folks are still asking if they're going to pass in New York State Regents. We have a huge problem. Standardized testing is a part of systemic racism as well. So for me, it's we have to stop pushing kids out and figure out how else we're going to educate them, because we're not solving the issue. We're actually pushing them into jails.
Okay. Were you going to go, Ken?
I'll go after you. I do enough talking.
So, yeah, I think that one of the most undertaught times from, the United States history is the Reconstruction. And I think Reconstruction is so important as it relates to like what's happening today. So Ken, just mentioned to us something about the further indoctrination into capitalism and economic subjugation. And I think that it's important to highlight, and I know I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, right? I study a lot of the institutes that were formed during Reconstruction. And many people don't know that when the Freedmen's Bureau was established, over 500 schools started by Black people were already in operation, in secret, in public, like depending on where you lived, right? And, they were blown away. If you read the report, for when they initially set out to start canvassing the area and deciding where they were going to place schools for these free Black children, they were blown away at how many Black children and Black educators were ready to go. And to them, this was astounding and yet still problematic. And they decided to shutter many of those schools. And when they shuttered many of those schools, they then started their own freedmen schools, and all of these Northern philanthropists started to come down to the South and give money to start these institutes. But what you'll notice is, like, when you're reading the doctrines for how these schools were started, the practices were barbaric, right? They wanted to bring in Native American students and strip them of their culture, their regalia. Like, I've heard of schools where students were kidnapped from their homes, brought in, like, they drowned themselves because they didn't even want to make it into the school, like just very horrifying things. But when you start to read the minutia, like when you start to read about the ways in which they were asked to form a line or not speak, or the way they were asked to dress or fold their hands, or I start to think about the schools that are bringing in those educators that are not trained in a way that they are empathetic or gentle with our children, and I start to see this mirror, right? It's the same stuff that's happening, the same subjugation, the same cost saving devices that, make our students workers and get them right in line with capitalism, get them right out the door to do what we need them to do. Right? There is no innovation. There is no imagination. There is no room for multilingual, multi-ethnic children. There is no room for free children. And so in reading about these Reconstruction schools that were established, there were some amazing thinkers like William Benson, Booker T. Washington, like you name them. There were some amazing thinkers that had these great ideas, but then you had these Northern philanthropists that came in and said, but here's what we really want you to do with our money. And it sounds like 2020. It sounds like 2020. And I would love to hear Ken's take on that. But honestly, I think that is a lot of where I feel our systemic racism in schools trickles down from.
I was muted on purpose, but I'm sitting here like, yes, amen. Yes, yes, yes. All right. So look, I'm gonna break it down like this. Education as an institution is a mirror to society, and it's a mirror to many of the positives for some folks to society and the negatives to others. Yuritsa just talked about the school-to-prison pipeline. I always encourage school leaders, I always say, look, if you really want to know the performance of your schools or your district, the first students you should talk to are the ones who dropped out or who are incarcerated, because they didn't fail. The system failed them. What resources and support did they not have access to, or were they not provided? And that's why I'm so glad you mentioned it earlier. There's no such thing as an achievement gap. That's garbage. There's an access and opportunity gap. When you guarantee access and opportunity, then we can start talking about achievement. But I would even question, how do you measure achievement? You see, money, you all mentioned where you teach. And here's the thing. I would argue that many of the students that I taught in South Central, Southeast, and East LA, what they were learning was beneficial in the context of the communities that they lived in. Yes, they can go to a college or a university if they want, but they're already equipped with an understanding and awareness of Where am I? What do I have access to? What is the history behind why I am where I am and I have access to what I do? And how might I use education as a means to get more so that I can actualize my full potential? But what I wanted to share also, kind of with what Erica just shared, is that think about all the reasons why, all the things we would associate with capitalism. You value time over intellect. You value conformity and compliance over divergent thinking. It's regimented. And, going back to, again, understanding history, Henry Ford was the one who adopted the 8-hour workday. Now ask yourself, how many of those things are valued in schools? No divergent thinking. Time equals busy equals productive. For example, I always ask the question, if you have a student that's in, let's say that's in the 6th grade, but they're performing in, let's say, their math class at a 10th grade level, why can't they take 10th grade math? Why are they forced to only do, you see, there's a compartment. Now, add that to educators or even teachers where you start to question things. You're not rewarded. You're subjugated, and depending upon who you are, you're actually punished for thinking differently. So when you start thinking about how education is set up and how you can be, essentially a divergent thinker and operate within the constraints of the system, it will help you. It's a type of liberation, to be honest with you all. I know for me personally, all of the questions that I asked, especially in grad school, I knew that I was going to get in trouble. And someone even put in the chat, Amanda put in the chat, to borrow from the late words of one of my other heroes, John Lewis, I was always getting into good trouble. And so when you think in terms of the words that we use in education that really place a high emphasis on meritocracy, growth mindset, grit, resilient, achievement, individual responsibility, you all even mentioned it with Bill O'Reilly, self-made. No one is self-made, by the way. When you start to have that awareness, you begin to question what you're being taught and why you're being taught that. And that goes back to, which I know the professor knows it, that goes back to some of the James Baldwin teachings, especially around the paradox of education. When you start to become aware of what you're being taught and why you're being taught, you will begin to start questioning that. And that is precisely why you see a lot of narratives excluded from the curriculum and a lot of things that we would value around, community and culture as a foundational component to our learning, why those are not valued in schools.
Can I say something really quick? So since we're talking about, I'm going to bring Baldwin back up in a second, but another book, and I'm sure, Jornea, we'll probably get a list of books for people to read and different resources. I'm writing down a ton of them right now, but The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. If you want to talk about the type of educators that we should have and what we should be teaching. Another thing I thought about, because this is I think I shared this with Jornea. What about creating our own schools? If the needs aren't being met, if kids aren't being really prepared to deal, not only like, this is also my dissertation too, but first and foremost, like Coates was talking about, he said he had a problem because during February, they would learn about Dr. King, and you would see, our ancestors like being beat over the head and stuff like that. But the teachers would encourage them to follow that example, but not say anything about the dangers that they were in once they stepped outside of the classroom. So that's one of the things I talked about, is we need to meet the kids where they're at. We need to give them strategies to overcome like where they are. So that's one of the things that I thought about, creating our own schools. If you remember, James Baldwin had a quote, this is not going to be verbatim, but it is in my dissertation. He talks about how every institution in this country is racist. He said, even in schools. So what he admonished the kids to do in school is to learn all that you can in school and then use it, kind of like what Ken was saying about regarding the Assata Shakur quote. Thankfully, that's another book that my 200 level students read. They do read Assata Shakur, the autobiography. Something else I wanted to mention when you said meritocracy, Ken, that reminded me of the article by Peggy McIntosh on male privilege and white privilege. And it talks about the myth of meritocracy. If we admit that there's white privilege, then we have to admit that there's a myth of meritocracy. And then the book by Dr. Tatum, the first chapter, it's over 20 years old, but why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? It's one thing that I give my students because it breaks down, it gives them more vocabulary on racism and anti-racism or whatever. So I think that I just wanted to add those books in there.
Wonderful resources. And yes, James, we will compile a list of resources to share out with educators as a recap of this amazing conversation. And one quote just from Carter G. Woodson that always just resonates within me, a very simple one: no man knows what he can do until he tries. And so as educators, I know a lot of times, yes, we might see the injustices, we might see that things need to change, but we also need to be the ones to try and to change. And we have a wonderful community of educators that are in this work together to truly empower every voice and truly make a difference. So with that being said, I will give all of you that last word of today to just speak to educators about what they can truly do to create that better future for their students.
Now we're speechless. I'll go first. I'll just share that, for everyone watching, and even those of you that have shared your thoughts in the chat, by the way, thank you. And in fact, I do want to say how much I appreciate Journée, for you, the whole entire Flipgrid team, this opportunity to spend this time with everyone who's in attendance and everyone who's a part of this panel. It has been so fulfilling for me and validating. Especially, from the good professor mentioning all these books that I've read. I'm like, okay, I'm going down the list. So, for the educators watching, I think the most important thing to share is that you have to be willing to do the internal work to get external results. You can't, it's, I noticed there was a pattern this year of everyone was like, okay, this social justice stuff, it's an important thing. And of course, for a lot of us, we're like, yeah, welcome to the movement. But then the response was, well, tell me a book to read. Like, you can read a book, but you still have to do the internal work. You have to understand that all of us carry biases. All of us are framed in the experiences that we have. And in many cases, if you don't question those experiences, then you don't have an awareness of what your role is in education. So for me, the first step is to look internally, hold a mirror up to yourself and say, how can I be a better version of myself tomorrow than I am today? And will that better version mean that I can reach more of my students and I can provide more of my students with an empowering and responsive learning environment? You see, you're not the savior, but you're also a part of that team in regards to the learning. So for me, it would be, what can you do for the internal work that will actualize itself with external results?
I believe Colin Powell said it best: have a mission and be demanding. When I think about just everything that we've gone through this year with the pandemic, I guess it's shown the world everything that African Americans have been facing for their entire lives. And we're not asking anyone to feel bad for us. We're not asking anyone to feel sorry for African American students. We're just saying, acknowledge that there's something wrong and do something about it. And like Ken said, a lot of educators, I know, especially when the pandemic hit, everyone was doing the work. Everyone was reading books. Twitter was almost like, Barnes and Nobles. Every time I went on there, everyone was listing books and strategies and resources. And now we're in December and no one's talking about it anymore. And so what I would say is just be authentic for your students, do the research, but do it with a purpose. If you're going to read a book, make sure that you get something out of that book and implement it. If you don't know how to implement it, do more research or ask your students. They sometimes have the answers to all of the questions that we've been asking. I know when I think about the Coaching Responsive series that I have with Flipgrid, the first thing that comes to mind is, what will my students want to learn about? How does this strategy help my students out after? So it's not all about fun and games. It's not about the elf on the shelf. It's not about, the KWL charts and everything else that people are doing for fun. It's what skills can I help my students to translate in their job after they graduate from me in December or in June. So what I would say is just be purposeful with what you're doing.
For me, my favorite quote is instruction is everywhere. And I'm a big advocate for expanding community training so that homeschool collectives, parents that are trying to do this on their own, or just educators who are very interested in unearthing narratives, whether that be history or just local narratives, and bringing it into the classroom, right? I think that they should have the tools, the strategies, they should have access to these trainings. I shouldn't just be for licensed educators, because as someone said, I don't remember who said it, like Emden says, like educators are everywhere, right? Anywhere you go. And so with that said, I think it's important for us to start unearthing those things immediately. Now is the time, right? And so social distance, keep your mask on, but now is the time to have conversations with folks that are at the AME church around the corner that you never stopped in. Like, now is the time to communicate with neighbors who have been there for 4 generations. Now is the time to unearth that resource, like that little community hub or museum or whatever organization that's been there, but you haven't had a chance to like stop in or call or follow their social media or delve into. Like, that's where the stories are. That's where the narratives are. And so I was very disappointed in my young 22-year-old self when I realized that many of the children in my classroom were from the eras, like their family members had important contributions to the eras that we were talking about. And a kid checked me once. Like, a kid literally sat in the classroom, was like, we were talking about someone, and I said something from the instruction that was wrong. I was 22 years old. I'll never forget it. He said, "That's my great-great-grandfather, and that's incorrect." And I was like, "Excuse me." And I remember going, "Okay, like, put me on." And then he told us this whole story, and I had to call and verify with mom and got the primary sources and came back and collected myself. And it was like, okay, I'm going to redeliver this lesson and he's going to help me. And he was my co-teacher that day. And it was the moment I realized that those first day surveys that you put in your drawer and you forget about, when you ask your kids, where do you hang out? Like, what does this community mean to you? Like, all of these different questions that you just put away and you don't implement, that's your instruction. It's everywhere. It's in those narratives, right? It's in the parents you talk to. It's in the organizations that stop by your school or around your neighborhood. It's in your borough, in your town, wherever you are. And so I really believe that the primary sources and the archives are great, but we are primary sources. Our communities, our families, our kids, like, that's where it starts. Begin there.
So first of all, I want to thank Jornea, Flipgrid, and everyone else who's responsible for this. I forgot to thank you all in the beginning. So in response to what Erica said, I think, first of all, as educators, we need to get creative. I also work at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Museum in Niagara Falls, New York. And just like our museum, other landmarks, historical places, they've gone virtual. So you can always, if you're an educator, you can talk to these different places, and they probably, if they haven't done so already, they're probably starting to do virtual tours. Another thing, like Yuritsa was saying before, as an educator, you need to read. I did a panel thing dealing with teaching tough topics to a 700 level history class. And one of the things that I advise them is, even if you've taught something 3 or 4 times before, read about it again. Like, you may think you have the information cold, but like Erica was saying, you may run into a student who knows it better than you do, or are related to someone who was there. And it's nothing wrong with being wrong either, because we're not perfect. We don't know everything. And also what Ken was saying, going along with what Ken was saying, Malcolm X has a quote: "The future belongs to them who prepare for it today." So I think as you're doing this, as you're reading, as you're trying to be creative with your virtual tours and just finding other ways to teach your students. There's one thing about 2020. Yes, it's been tough, but it's also made us to be resourceful and creative in the way that we disseminate information. And like Kim was saying, my personal opinion is that we need to look at the blueprint that was laid out for us by those who came before us. And in order to do that, we need to be quiet. We need to learn about ourselves and connect with our ancestors. That's my thought. So
I love all of this. And educators, be vulnerable. It's okay to share what you don't know. Have that journey with your students. And I really love learning strategies. If you want to use maybe an anticipation guide, give them some statements to either address what they know or have lack of knowledge of, or maybe their bias, and then present them with multiple resources to discover those primary sources, and then go back to those same statements and look at it through that other lens. That's what learning is about. Looking at things through a lens after you've been given some other information. As James mentioned, you can read something 2-3 times, but that fourth time you may see it a different way after having another experience, either with a firsthand account with someone, or from another text, or from another experience. So this work is never done, but just note, as we always say, our mission is to empower every voice, and that also means empowering students to ask those questions. Don't be afraid for students to challenge that thinking. That will create the change. So empower every voice so that students can also respect the diverse voices of others. And with that being said, we will send you off, and hopefully we'll have extended conversation on social media. So feel free. Everyone's Twitter handles are right inside of their images right now. Feel free to stay connected, and we will send out resources for you to continuously just improve your practices, as well as meet the needs of the students that we're serving. And so we'll say bye-bye for now, but we'll see you later.